I realise that after the 2018 referendum, the faint-hearted might have abandoned ship. But as we've already heard this evening, the reverse has happened, with huge numbers turning up to large events. Be encouraged that heroic figures like William Wilberforce experienced any number of defeats and setbacks before ultimately bringing about a change of heart, a change of direction, and a change of law. They knew that their cause was just as this cause is just. I often take heart from the story of a boy on the seashore where the tide had washed up thousands of stranded starfish. One by one, he started to throw the starfish back into the sea. A laughing, skeptical adult approached him and remonstrated and said, "There are just too many. You can't save them all. It won't make any difference." And the boy replied, "It'll make a difference to that one." And that in turn reminds me of the saying of the Jewish rabbi who said that the person who saves a single life saves the world. That is the task that we have and that you folk gathered here tonight have. I especially pay tribute to some of those whose earlier campaigns, I think back to 1983, led to the Eighth Amendment, with one leading actuary estimating that as a result of those efforts, a staggering, not one life, but 100,000 unborn babies' lives were saved as a result of their work. In the fight to save lives, we will inevitably encounter fierce opposition or ridicule. But it's our duty to keep alive a burning light. And this is, as I'll contend tonight, the supreme human rights issue, the very right to life itself. Friends, this year is the 75th anniversary from 1948 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was promulgated as the world emerged from the horrors of the Holocaust and indeed of 2 world wars. Enlightened leaders crafted not one but 2 hugely important international documents, the Convention on the Crime of Genocide and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Its 30 articles include the right to asylum, freedom from torture, free speech, the right to education, and much else besides. It includes civil and political rights, rights of liberty and privacy. But foundational to the Universal Declaration is Article 3, which adamantly proclaims that everyone has the right to life, to liberty, and the security of person. Everyone has the right to life. That momentous document states that it has its origins, and I quote from the preamble, "the duty to confront barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind." That was the raison d'etre for the Universal Declaration. Its opening preamble emphasizes inalienable rights and human dignity. Now, in the United Kingdom, I serve on the Joint Committee of the Commons and the Lords on Human Rights. Be clear, it's illogical when a concern for rights isn't reinforced by a concern for duties, especially to the weakest and the voiceless. And this evening, I want to remain focused on that lack of consistency and the meaningless cant and humbug which ignores the right from which all other rights flow, the right to life itself. In 1968, as a schoolboy, shocked by the assassination of Robert Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King, I got involved in youth politics. Last week, I reread Dr. King's famous, iconic, inspiring speech, "I Have a Dream," delivered on August 28, 1963, during a march on Washington. And in a commentary on that speech, and who better than the niece of Dr. Martin Luther King, Dr. Alveda Celeste King, last week wrote a challenging and startling commentary on the "I Have a Dream" speech. And she attacked the inconsistency in the vocabulary of human rights. I had an idea of what she might say because I chaired a meeting for her at Westminster, in which she highlighted that startling inconsistency, telling us that if her uncle was alive today, she believed he would be a leader of the pro-life movement. Now, she's particularly well qualified to talk about these issues. Dr. King is a woman who has changed her mind. She had 2 abortions and described the consequences for mother and child, believing that both lives matter, believing that abortion leads to the death of one person and to the defeat of another. And last week, commemorating her uncle's iconic speech, she said this: "Sometimes people think it's easier to help me kill my child than it is to help me. There has to be a better human way to serve humanity than killing." We need millions of people like Dr. King to see that they must change their minds too in the way that she has done. How much easier, though, it would have been for Dr. King to remain quiet in order not to risk the ridicule or the taboos of our cancel culture. Her statement that she could remain silent no more echoes the words of 2 remarkable people executed in an earlier generation before the promulgation of that Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think of Edith Stein, who insisted that those who remain silent, she said, those who remain silent are responsible. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Protestant theologian, who said, not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. I've lost count of the number of times angry people have shouted the slogan, "My body, my choice," or "My right to choose" at me. Why should we take those slogans head on? Well, take the slogan itself, "My right to choose," me, my, I, at the heart of the equation, not you or your needs. It demands rights, but says nothing about duties. And it elevates choice to the status of dogma with no consideration of the consequences of the exercise of choice. Imagine if I were to use that same slogan to defend the insatiable consumption of the world's resources. How would the Green Movement respond? Imagine if I used it to justify some act of cruelty to animals. How would animal rights activists respond? Imagine if I used it to justify appalling discrimination against a disabled person, or a person of color, or a person of a different sexual orientation. And rightly, the protest wouldn't be far behind. I often think that the day a fox or a transgenic pig arrives at Westminster or the Doyle, brandishing placards saying, "Save the unborn child," or "Save the human race," we might wake up to the sheer illogicality of the positions we strike. We have a great deal of PC these days, political correctness. But I would say particularly to those of you who are thinking of being involved in politics or public life, we need less of that kind of PC and more of a different kind of PC, political courage. We have got to... We've got to provide encouragement and leadership for people like the young woman we heard from just a few minutes ago. And mercifully, as we see in many jurisdictions around the world, people are changing their minds, and the rising generation can see the banality of some of the slogans I've mentioned. And this isn't a trivial question or a fringe issue. Recall that 1948 condemnation of barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. Before anyone justifies an abortion, they should be required to gaze into the diaphanous, translucent beauty of the womb and in awe contemplate the extraordinary humanity of these tiny new members of the human race, and then watch with the full force of British or Irish law the pain and suffering that we permit. Friends, spare me the slogans. Find conscience. Embrace the supreme human right, the right to life itself. I've got 2 other points I want to leave with you tonight. One concerns the impact that legalizing abortion has had on society, and the other concerns the consequences. What does it lead to? Industrialized abortion, what does it lead to? Well, Malcolm Muggeridge once said that it had only taken a generation, and this was in the 1960s, for, I quote, a crime against humanity to be regarded as an act of medical compassion. There is no doubt that abortion dramatically changes the nature of medicine with the discarding of the injunction of the ancient Hippocratic oath to do no harm. It compromises medics and penalizes those who refuse to collaborate and exercise their conscience. Think of the 2 Scottish midwives who lost their jobs after refusing to be complicit in abortion. It changes relationships between parents and no doubt suits those men who find it convenient to push a woman into the hands of the abortionist. And it robs us of children whose gifts we sorely need at a time when the decline in the birth rate is becoming a ticking time bomb in our lives. It makes us a crueler and less compassionate society. The child is seen as a threat rather than as a blessing. Abortion revolves around ideology, but also around money. We've created a system which generates millions of pounds for individual abortionists and their clinics, where in a monumental conflict of interest, we allow them also to act as the counsellors and referring agents. My other point is about the elastic law of endless extension. What happens when you discard the belief that the right to life is a foundational right? Once you do a little bit, to what does it lead? Well, in Ireland, as we just heard, there have been nearly 34,000 abortions since the law was changed. And that's, as we heard, about one abortion for every 7 babies that are born. And we know as well that there are already calls within the Irish government to review the law and to provide even more extreme provisions with the full decriminalisation through the whole of the 9 months of pregnancy. And what does that replicate? Well, in 1967, Britain was told that abortion would only be used in extreme circumstances. It was a lie then, and it's a lie now. In the UK, not 1 in 7, but 1 in 4 pregnancies now ends in an abortion. That's 200,000 every year. There have been 10 million abortions in the UK since the law was changed, 1 every 2.5 minutes. And in the case of disability, since 1990, abortion is permitted right up to and even during birth. And the consequence of that elasticity in the law has led to 90%, for instance, 90% of all babies with Down syndrome being aborted. And it's led to sex-selective abortions, where little girls have been targeted in acts of gendercide, and our collaboration in such programs on a massive scale overseas. The UK exported this gendercide under the label of reproductive rights. The result, in communist China, through programs funded in part by the UK, there are now 30 million more men than women because of gender abortions. And it will lose between 600 and 700 million people by the end of the century, half of its current population, with significant geopolitical implications. But at its heart is the belief that children are a problem rather than a blessing. And let me ask, where were the political activists when we were campaigning against the CCP's one-child policy? The political parties in the UK, all of them were aiding, abetting and supporting it. And to what else has this led? The UK Parliament was lied to when it was told that without experiments on human embryos, no progress could be made on the treatment of serious illness. Since experiments were legalized in 1990, an estimated 3.5 million human embryos have been destroyed or experimented upon. And where does this eugenics lead? Well, there was a report only this morning in the Times newspaper that an artificial intelligence program, ironically developed here in Ireland, will identify, the AI program will identify which embryos in future implantation will be allowed to survive and be implanted and which should be discarded. This is AI-led eugenics, We need instead authentic intelligence, not artificial intelligence. We need ethical intelligence, not eugenics. The special status which Parliament was told the human embryo would be given was rapidly jettisoned, and grotesque demands have been acceded to. So the embryo experiments then led to animal-human hybrids and attempts at non-reproductive clothing, procedures that were foretold by C.S. Lewis in his dystopian novel, That Hideous Strength, published in 1945, but this is fiction that is now fact. The subversion of good ethics and good science also subverts the academy and our intellectual life. Listen to the Oxford University ethicist who chillingly says newborn babies are not, quotes, actual persons, newborn babies, with, quotes, a moral right to life. What we used to call infanticide, he calls, his words, after-birth abortion. And this takes us to the next implication, the next runaway train. While many of those who champion euthanasia do so, I'm sure, with the best of motives, I believe that too is a profound mistake. Its advocates suggest it's a well-researched, well-established medical intervention, and that's simply not the case. It's yet another lie. We should oppose it because so-called limitations and safeguards are vague with elastic properties enabling their effortless extension. We should oppose it because conscientious objection of medics are routinely compromised or ignored and arrogantly disregarded. We should oppose it and resist it on grounds of public safety. It is simply not possible to allow euthanasia for a determined few without putting much larger numbers of people at risk. That's what's happened in Holland and Belgium, where there is now even child euthanasia, and it's what is happening in Canada, where only last week a disabled veteran described seeking help to get a chairlift and being offered a lethal injection. Instead of promoting bad laws, legislators, policymakers and governments should work instead for world-class palliative care and resources for healthcare that values assisted living rather than expediting death. Without euthanasia, last year in the UK, there were around 600,000 deaths. A tiny number of hard cases made it into newspaper headlines, and it's that which drives the debate. And as with abortion, euthanasia is also driven by economics. It was Baroness Warnock who led the argument for embryo experimentation, who said this in advocating euthanasia, I quote, "If you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your families' lives, and you're wasting the resources of the National Health Service. Pensioners in mental decline are wasting people's lives because of the care they require." I close the quote. Little wonder that my colleague, another member of the House of Lords, Baroness Jane Campbell, who has muscular atrophy, a commissioner, incidentally, of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and speaks in Parliament through an oxygen mask, offered this alternative view. She said, "Disabled people's lives are invariably seen as less worthwhile than those of non-disabled people. Euthanasia is dangerous and threatening. I and many other severely disabled people will not perceive your support for it as an act of compassion, but one founded in fear and prejudice." And I would add, in this argument about resources. And that takes us back then to the human rights and human dignity of the most vulnerable. Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights begins by asserting everyone's right to life shall be protected by law. No one shall be deprived of their life intentionally. No euthanasia, in other words. A right to self-determination is not a right to self-termination. There's no right to die under human rights conventions, and we all know that a so-called right to die very rapidly becomes, if it's resource-driven, a duty to die. Let me draw to a close. As a little boy, my mother took me back to the west of Ireland, to Mayo, to the remote mountain villages around Loch Mask, where she was born and grew up. I wanted to know the story of the abandoned cottages and the people who'd once lived there. 1 million died in the Great Starvation, 3 million emigrated, fulfilling the hope of Malthus, another economist, that, and I quote, a great part of the population should be swept from the soil of Ireland. And they listened as well, not just to his advice, but that of the civil servant Charles Trevelyan, who said that Ireland needed to be cured of overpopulation. 1.3 million of the Irish people who fled the famine emigrated via the port of Liverpool. I've served as a Liverpool Member of Parliament, and the cathedral parish was in my constituency. It was built on the site of the workhouse, where thousands of Irish people died in destitution or poverty. In the neighbouring parish, in 1 week, there were 166 burials. 105 of them were of children. The failure to safeguard and cherish those lives manifested itself, and through the ideas of people like Malthus and Trevelyan, in the next generation, when in 1907, Beatrice and Sidney Webb published a racist, eugenic Fabian tract describing in terms Irish Catholics, Polish, Russian and German Jews, I quote, as thriftless and irresponsible, and their desire, they said, to have children, resulting in England's national deterioration and the country falling to the Irish and the Jews. Well, in every age and in every generation, every such similar repugnant prejudice and bigotry has to be combated in the defense of human life. In Greek mythology, when the king of the Lydians asked the oracle of Delphi, what's the most important thing a person should know? The oracle replied, know who you are. And I would simply say to the people of this great country, knowing your story should not lead you to becoming prisoners of history, but should lead you to a determination to resist the same distorted arguments and attitudes determining events in our own time. We had some words written in Irish and English on a card which my late mother kept pinned up in our kitchen when I was growing up as a child. Those words said, "It is in the shelter of each other's lives that the people live." Providing that shelter and the joy of the pro-life movement is what matters so much. It counteracts the anger and the despair of the pro-abortion lobby, the defeatism and the violence that represents. And it represents the best hope for the future of Ireland. It's a simple truth to keep in mind as all of you here tonight continue to insist that the greatest of all rights is the right to life, and that you will give voice and through your actions provide that shelter which enables the gift of life to flourish and for the people to live. Please go on giving everything you can in support of this great pro-life cause, and thank you for inviting me.